Hello everyone, my name is Vanessa, and on behalf of Canadian Women in Sport, I want to welcome you to today's webinar in partnership with She's for Sports, entitled We Are Sport, LGBTQ Inclusion, LGBTQI2S Inclusion. Bonjour à tous, je m'appelle Vanessa et au nom de Femmes Sport au Canada, bienvenue au webinaire d'aujourd'hui en partenariat avec She's for Sports, intitulé We Are Sport, LGBTQI2S Inclusion. Today I'll be playing a supporting role to our host, Ainka. So if you have any questions, you run into any tech issues, please feel free to populate the chat. I also have the Q&A function on, so you can put any of your questions that you have for Ainka or the panelists there, and I'll be able to flag that to her. We reached capacity today in our registration, which is excellent. So we will be broadcasting this on our Facebook page. I'll have the link in the chat momentarily, so you can share that with anyone that you know who wasn't able to register. Before we get started, I'd like to thank Sport Canada for their support in this initiative. Avant de commencer, j'aimerais remercier Sport Canada pour leur soutien dans cette initiative. And without further ado, Ainka, I'll kick it to you to introduce and lead our awesome group of panelists today. Ainka is the founder of She's for Sports.
Thank you, Vanessa. You know, this is going to be a very exciting conversation. This conversation is part of our larger digital series, We Are Sport. We're going to be addressing many different topics from July to September. Again, as Vanessa said, this is a partnership with Canadian Women in Sport and Sport Canada. Our first month was July, and we are talking about LGBTQ inclusion and advocacy. In August, we'll be talking about leadership and diversity, and in September, we'll be talking about mental health. So lots of conversations, a lot of great sport leaders who are from the BIPOC community. And I'm excited about this series and you know, hearing all of their stories and journeys and experiences. She's for Sports launched in 2016. I launched it because I didn't see a lot of diversity in sport media. And I also wanted to create a safe space for women and diverse groups to talk about sports, to talk about their contributions, and to talk about some of the issues like pay equity, gender equity, inclusion that, you know, we don't always hear those narratives in mainstream sports media. So thanks for tuning in today. As I said, we launched, I believe it was July 15th on Instagram Live, and we also are supplementing this series with Zoom panels like this one. And for my French speaking community tuning in, bonjour et tout, je m'appelle Ainka Jess. I'm the founder of She's for Sports. So we're going to get into this talk right now, and I'm going to introduce you to our awesome panel. Christine Sue is a second-generation immigrant settler who identifies as non-binary, gender fluid, and as a queer woman of color. They've been a lifelong multi-sport athlete whose work lies particularly within the 2SLGBTQI communities, using anti-oppression framework to make sports and physical activities more accessible for underrepresented, marginalized populations. This work includes ensuring that mainstream athletic spaces can strive to be safer and more inclusive for everyone. As a trauma-informed and harm reductive lens, from a trauma-informed and harm reductive lens. They are certified learning professional, healing-centered body positive personal trainer, and physical and health educator for children, youth, and adults. Christine is currently working as a diversity and inclusion learning consultant who designs, develops, and delivers adult learning workplace training, specifically in the sports context. They were one of the founders and previous chair of Flags of Glory, and currently sits on the Sports Inclusion Task Force as one of the coordinating member working to strive for 2SLGBTQI inclusion in sports across Canada. They have worked with sports organizations, including the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Sports, Canadian Association of Coaching, and often support physical educators who are coaches working in schools and those running queer recreational sport leagues. Next, we have Natasha Spence, who goes by Natasha the Nightmare Spence. Watch out, everybody. She's a world champion professional boxer, certified amateur and professional boxing coach, and elite trainer. With a current boxing record of 8-3-2, 6 knockouts, she continues to actively train, as well as teach clients and aspiring young boxers. She won the WBF super lightweight title in May of 2016, and has traveled around the world as a pugilist. Nightmare is known and feared mostly for her punching power, with amazing hand speed and the footwork to go with it, and she is a force to be reckoned with. And rounding out our panel is Aprille Deus. Aprille is one of 4 newly appointed assistant coaches for the Ryerson University men's basketball program. As an active coach in the basketball community, she works with Canada Basketball's men's high performance as a video coordinator, assists the Raptors 905 during open training camps and practices, and is also an assistant coach and athletic performance coach at King's Christian Collegiate. As a former collegiate player at Acadia University in Nova Scotia and George Brown College, Aprille has a diverse athletic background on court and in the weight room. Off the court, she's equally as passionate about the arts. As a local known creative in Toronto, she looks to use her skills to support local businesses and influencers, arts programs, and LGBTQ+ groups to enhance their brands and promote community. So this is our panel, and we're going to get into the conversation. Christine, I'll start with you. You wear one of the many hats as a holistic healing centered personal trainer. Can you break down what that means for anyone who may not be familiar with some of those terms?
Sure. First off, thank you so much for having me on the panel and to be sharing this space with Aprille and Natasha. It's an honor. In terms of those terms, what do they mean? So in terms of the holistic side of things, I think as somebody who is very much constantly thinking about what are people's experiences in the sporting space. I get a lot of stories from folks who no longer play sports and are often talking about trauma that they've had from trying to participate in sports or specifically from high school gym class. And so in my approach, making it more holistic, I often use that space for folks to be able to talk about those experiences, to also center mental health as well as physical health and emotional health, and being able to work on all of those things in relationship to one another. So that takes up that sort of the holistic side of what I mean by personal training. And then with the term healing centered is very much sort of the next step to that is, okay, so what does that actually look like for folks? So for clients that I work with one-on-one, it often means that we do check-ins and check-outs. We talk about their experiences during the session, and then we also talk about it afterwards in terms of what things come up for them. I currently also do some work at Sheena's Place as a facilitator too, which is a place that offers free programming for folks with eating disorder and disordered eating. And that's a lot of these types of this type of work, talking about movement, talking about having a body. And I always say my tagline is having a body is very hard. And that and it is often quite useful and lands really well for pretty much anybody and everybody. And so I use that approach to talk to people and bring back agency and empower people who might not otherwise feel like they have agency in an athletic space. So how do they re-enter a gym space without feeling, or perhaps how to cope with the feelings of anxiety, and to be able to then access movement in ways that feel good for them. So that's essentially, in short, what those terms mean to me. And a lot of times I also offer it to people that I work with and say, what does that mean to you? And then we work together in a collaborative way to train or to move. So,
you mentioned some key words right now that are kind of, fitting for what's happening. You talked about mental health and anxiety. Natasha, I'll bring you into this conversation. There's a lot of, as we can see in the media and across the border, and even here, there's a lot of unrest with racial tension, and some of the things we've seen with the murders of Black people in the States. How is your boxing community and yourself coping through all of this, when it comes to that lens of mental health and trying to process everything?
First, I want to start off by saying thank you for having me and for giving me this platform to share my voice. That's actually a really, really good question. Obviously, it hits me near and dear. I experience and have experienced just seeing it through a different lens than a lot of people that I surround myself with. Being a minority in a certain environment, I feel like growing up and throughout most of my life, I've always been that minority, whether it was because of race, sexuality, being a female. I just found that being a strong female and the sports I chose to do, the things outside of work and school I chose to do, like ride a motorcycle, stuff like that. I've always been that minority. And it's funny because me and my friends would call me the triple threat because I was always a 3 times minority. And to be honest with you, I felt very lonely a lot of the time up until recently. Seeing how many people are standing together and willing to be a voice for minorities, people that you wouldn't have thought or guessed would stand up and speak up. I'm finding that it's definitely helping. I don't feel as alone. It's always been happening. Stuff like that has always been happening. And to see now that certain people wouldn't stand for it, where you might not have known that in the past. It's comforting, and it's a painful process, but that's the world we live in, unfortunately. And hopefully it will continue to change. Just like the sport of boxing for women, it has changed. It's just so slow motion, but you just have to be patient and keep fighting.
Aprille, I'll bring you into this discussion. We see very visibly the NBA and WNBA, addressing racial unrest and supporting different movements, Black Lives Matter, messaging through, their clothes they're wearing, their support for Breonna Taylor. Can you talk about the basketball community and just sort of, what culture they're growing to show people how they are looking at diversity and inclusion?
Yeah, and just like the rest of us, I think, thank you so much for having me on the panel. I think a big thing to me that stands out about the basketball community is that we've had to rely on our male counterparts for so long for it to happen. And with this being a pandemic and with the Black Lives Matter movement and all the racism, it's just unfortunate that we had to wait for something like George Floyd, like his death was so unfortunate. But for that to spark such a movement, it's a double-edged sword. And I think particularly when you look at the NBA, you saw, the last few days, every man is pretty much wearing like a WNBA bright orange sweater. And that in itself is key because and I'm pretty sure it started with Kobe Bryant and with LeBron James, with them always tweeting about Sue Bird or Diana Taurasi, and things like that are super key for helping us, catapult this movement of women in sport, and really paying attention to the league. And now with the league being showcased, they have League Pass. And now like it literally, their bubble is very similar to what the men's bubble looks like. So I think that's just like what I'm starting to notice right now.
And, let's talk about allyship. Christine, I read something that you wrote, and I don't have it pulled up here, but I do remember it. It was a quote that you made. You said that there's policies that organizations are putting out, but the policies won't work if the education piece isn't a part of it. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So a lot of the work that I do outside of sort of the sports realm is very much training with workplaces. And so a lot of times, what I end up seeing is that the policies don't get used or that they don't exist, specifically around anti-racism, anti-oppression, that it doesn't exist isn't brought into specifically private sectors. And so it would just end up being a document that collects dust. And so that training piece is so important because that actually brings it to life. It allows people to have access to language that perhaps the company or the organization uses to be able to advocate for themselves and for each other. So that's where that allyship piece can really come in, if that's built right into the policy and saying that managers, or in this case, in the sporting context, that coaches can advocate for their athletes for whatever needs that they may have, or to intervene. A lot of times when we're thinking about racial justice or experiences of racism in sports, there isn't a mechanism that allows for athletes to say, there were racial slurs, or I'm experiencing inequitable treatment by a specific person or a ref or whatever it may be, there is a mechanism or even a language or knowledge for athletes to know to use that, to then say, let's make sure that this doesn't happen again. So it just continues and it's perpetual. And so training is such an important aspect to support policy, and it really allows for people to learn how to use policies to then advocate. And so that very much ties into the notion or the practice of allyship, where you know, coaches can find out that piece of information and share that on, and that could very much be allyship. To say, hey, this exists. Or it could very much be that they themselves are knowing what types of risks they're taking if they were to stand up to even perhaps the CEO of a sport organization, to say, this is not okay, and this is the policy that you said you want to uphold in terms of creating an inclusive and safer space. And I know that there's a lot of work being done around safe sport right now across Canada, and specifically around sexual abuse, but also I think what that needs to expand to is very much about folks who are racialized in sports, and experiencing all of these things. Racism, transphobia, all of those experiences are unsafe experiences. And so that's where policies need to change, and then also the training itself need to allow for people to understand those changes or understand how to use them, because athletes are athletes first. We come in because we want to play, right? And we want to have fun. We're not being told like how to even read a document. Heck, we don't even read those documents. We're just like, how do I play and how do I sign up, right? And that's about it. But unfortunately, at this moment in time, I'd say really pretty much across the board from my work so far, most athletes aren't really taught or made aware of sort of how they can self-advocate, and that teammates or coaches or even parents, for those who are younger, can really look at the policies to then advocate for a safer space in sport. And that's across all spectrums of identities and experiences.
Natasha, I'll get you into this conversation on allyship. We interviewed Mary Spencer, Olympian, Canadian Olympian boxer, and she noted that the boxing culture is still, you know, an old boys club. What more steps can you know, the boxing industry take to support allyship for LGBTQ athletes?
That's a really good question. I feel like, I mean, Mary is definitely right. It is a old boys club mentality, and a lot of the time, your voice doesn't necessarily get heard. And even if you do have the courage to speak up about certain things, the energy or the atmosphere majority of the time isn't a safe one or isn't an inviting one. Steps that can be taken. I mean, where do I begin? At this point, I honestly don't even know. Like I'm thinking of different scenarios I've been in where I know if it was in a different workplace setting, it would be one call to HR and boom, 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 you fired. And I've been in many scenarios where I just, for my own safety or for my livelihood, because that's my career, I bit my tongue and sat there uncomfortable or embarrassed thinking, what am I doing this for? Why am I, like, it's the love of the sport. And I'm sure I'm not the only one that's been, you know, in those type of environments or scenarios, but especially with boxing, I feel like because it's an old boys club mentality, they're protected. A lot of people, when I say they're protected, I'm not saying specifically men or specifically a certain person. It's whoever is making you feel that way. A lot of the time they're protected and they feel almost empowered to joke around or to, you know, to make comments or to do certain things where, like I said, if it was a workplace, there's no way they would even consider it because HR and suspension are fired. And that's just, so for steps that can be taken, I don't want to say that it's not possible, but it's going to be a long process, and everything counts. I mean, I think something that would definitely help is people around you being support for you or standing behind you for when you do speak up, because it's hard being that only person to voice something. Or if you witness something, you witness people, you know, saying certain things or acting certain ways that is not appropriate, you know, just being that ally for them and being like, hey buddy, like cut that out, you know, something as simple as that, which I've experienced as well. It makes a world of difference, and it helps that person find their voice. It helps them, you know, cope with what's going on.
Aprille, Natasha talked a lot about support and, you know, wanting to be in an environment where as an athlete, she does feel supported. Can you talk about how you're supporting other basketball athletes from the LGBTQ community who are coming out or want to trust you to talk to you about their identity and sharing?
Yeah, I think like everything Natasha's saying, I'm like, whew, we've all experienced this. It's crazy. Word for word, for real. And when it comes to like the youth that are coming out and coming up, for me, I obviously, like, you don't want to play like doctor, you don't want to play psychologist. For me, it's more of like, I've been in your shoes. So let's sit down, talk to me. What's going on? And it's not just with youth, it's like even adults around my age, like that late 20s, early 30s. I still know people who are not necessarily athletes, but just in general, who are struggling with coming out or accepting, you know, they might be non-binary, or they might be lesbian, or they might be whatever it is that they are, just identifying as queer. And I think the best thing that looking back, is that I've ever done is just listen, and just asking why are you feeling this? Why is this happening? What's going on with you? Like, and it's just being there for someone that I think is so powerful. Not a lot of, at least like lesbian women, I know have come out until they were actually settled down. They were finally ready to start a family. And then they're like, all right, mom, dad, sister, brother, friends, this is who I am. This is what's happening. But for me, I was lucky enough to have a family, or I am lucky enough to have a family who accepted me early on. And even though it was like really hard, it's just showing them like, I am not a bad person. I don't do drugs. I don't steal. I don't lie, like all this stuff. And it's just making sure that they understand that the standards are not different than someone who identifies as like part of that heteronormative space. So.
Thank you for your transparency and
No
sharing that with us.
Yeah.
Christine, can you talk about Brave Spaces and what that means, and how you were working with Canadian Women in Sports to support that?
Sure. So in the way that I do training, a lot of times I'm holding space for really hard conversations. And depending on the topic, oftentimes it is very much identity based. And so when I go through some guidelines to help us, to help enable people to participate as much as they can, I do offer this idea of brave space, which I can't personally claim to be my own work. It definitely came from very much a lot of the Black folks and Black leaders who are doing racial justice work across North America. And that idea of, you know, we can't guarantee safe spaces for people, that the sense of safety can immediately go within seconds as soon as somebody opens up their mouth and says something, or maybe they look at you in a different way, that you immediately feel unsafe. So I think it's a great shift towards acknowledging that it takes so much more energy for some folks to enter a space because their lived experience or their identities are being tabled as a topic of conversation. So that idea allows for people to just acknowledge that for some folks, in order to participate, in order to share, it requires a lot of vulnerability, and it requires other folks to show up, as you mentioned earlier, around allyship, even within that space. And it gets a little tricky when I'm hosting spaces or facilitating spaces that is about allyship and people are trying to learn about it, that they, in those moments, may forget that other people may experience harm as they talk about allyship. So that brave space is something that I've taken with me and to share with folks, both within specific conversations around anti-racism and anti-oppression, and also within sports, because it's that idea of trauma-informed approach, where we can acknowledge that people are being brave by showing up. And it takes so much for some folks to even just show up. You know, as Natasha, you've mentioned, and then also Aprille, like being the only kind of sort of folks in a space where everybody else is different from you is such a hard position to work from. And so oftentimes that we end up internalizing those ideas or messages as well. So it takes a lot of bravery sometimes, or oftentimes, to just show up, because of all of the things that are happening around the world. It means that when you show up, no one else can see what's really happening for you. So I think that's a great concept for folks who are working, especially with younger folks in sports, and working with girls and women and people who are historically and still currently also often experience a lot of misogyny or a lot of experiences of harm in a sporting space that often only benefit selective identities, that we're all showing up with whatever we've got, and we have to be brave. And that takes a lot of energy on certain days. So that allows for other people to be able to show up for us as well, and saying, you know what, I see you, I see your bravery. And sometimes that takes even saying that sometimes in a space, you know, we've got the water gates open as soon as I say that. So so that's definitely something to offer, I think, for a lot of folks to think about. You know, what are the conditions that we can create or bring into a space in order for people to be brave and continuing to be brave, to the point where they no longer need to be brave and that they feel like they belong. So that's sort
Natasha,
of the
sorry, thanks. Natasha, I want to bring you into that conversation. Can you tell me, just take us back to when you first started, you know, pursuing boxing. Who showed up for you in your family or community during your time navigating, you know, getting into this career and also coming out?
I would say that I was very lucky in that sense in terms of my career and choosing the path of boxing. Pretty much everybody in my life showed up for me. I feel like I finally found something that I could excel at, and I excelled quickly. I started boxing when I was 19. And even getting into it, like my coaches would joke and be like, you know, you're lying. You've been boxing for years before you got here. And it was the first time ever putting gloves on. So I think, you know, finding something that you're just natural at, it actually allows for you to be your true, genuine self a lot easier. I lost myself in the sport, and I think the people around me that knew me and the ones that were getting to know me, they could see that, you know, when you're doing something like that, it's on a different level, you know, and it for me, it was where I could feel safe and I could feel like I could be myself. So I think when people recognize that, it's easier for them to be there for you and to support you. To be honest, my mom was always my biggest fan, and that actually surprised me. Just because, you know, female in a sport that you can get hurt, and you know, I didn't expect that from her. But when she came to my first fight, and I could hear her in the bleachers yelling, "Knock her out, break her nose," and I'm, you know, being a Christian woman too at the time, and I'm just like, hearing her root for me was definitely a highlight of it, and what got me to keep going. My dad actually was probably the only one that didn't support me at all in that decision, and I don't even know how I feel about that. I think that's just good. We're just gonna leave that there. But in terms of being who I am, and I guess coming out, if that I don't believe I have a coming out story. I know everyone, you know, I hear people talk about that, and I've always just been me. I've been the type of person to just, you know, love who I love, do what I think is right, learn from my mistakes, and just be free and be open. And it's been a journey. It's been good. It's been hard. It's been amazing. But ever since I was young, I just knew that I was different and I wasn't going to hide it. So I just continue to just basically do me. And I try not to suppress my feelings, my thoughts, my emotions, who I love, because at the end of the day, coming up, even in high school or when I first started boxing, I didn't see many women out there like me. So at a young age, it was hard for me to be expressive and be who I truly genuinely felt was deep inside of me, because I looked around and I was like, well, what's out there that can mirror me or resemble me? So I just try to be genuine behind closed doors and in the public, be my genuine true self, so that maybe if there is, a young female out there that wants to take up any sport and sees a post that I make, she can relate and be like, wow, it doesn't matter who you want to love, in my opinion. And I don't necessarily hold a label. I don't call myself gay or lesbian or bisexual. I just love, and I always have. I've encountered people that are like, oh, I thought you were into dudes, and in the boxing community, especially, guys in the gym, I thought you were into dudes. I'm into people. That's my response. I'm just into people. I'm into love, and you treat me well and love me well, I love you back. Yeah.
Thanks for sharing that. Aprille, I want to segue a little bit into your own journey. You were a student athlete, and now you are getting into, well, you've always been coaching, but you have a great opportunity with the Ryerson Rams men's basketball team. Can you talk about just your experience as a student athlete, and then transitioning more into coaching, and what that has been for you? We know basketball is a sport, one of the pro sports where we are seeing more women either assistant coaching at the pro league, but varsity, we still aren't seeing as many women who are coaching. So can you talk a little bit about how you are trying to make history here?
Yeah, well, I'm not, in terms of my coming out story, I literally came out 3 times. That's how many times I tell people I came out. More so in terms of like making it official with my parents, because that's like the biggest hurdle, at least in my experience. And if I transition into the coaching experience, like as an athlete, I went to a K university, so it was easy to just be who you were, because you were away from home. Like that's in Nova Scotia. And a lot of the dominant athletes or stars from every team, I found were very like open, where they loved who they loved, especially with our girls rugby team. But they were just amazing to be around, and like made me feel more comfortable about just being myself and just being open. And that's where I encountered, having my first same-sex relationship. And then moving into like graduating, you date a few here and there, but I soon realized that looking at the landscape of coaching, there weren't that many women in the spaces that I wanted to be in, let alone, I don't think there were any. There was one individual, one of my friends, Michaela, who was an assistant and doing operational work with the Ryerson Rams men's basketball team under Roy Rana, who is now with Sacramento Kings. But she was probably the only female I've heard of on a men's staff at the university level. And so for me, I didn't really have anyone to look up to, let alone, being a big age gap, because she was, I'm pretty sure she's my age, or if not a year or two older. And so for me, looking into the coaching field, I manifested 4 years ago. I was like, I'm going to be with Ryerson. And that was 4 years ago. And so to think that I could be potentially someone who can now inspire younger females younger females to be within the coaching space at a high level is something that I felt like is my responsibility, even though it's not like I can represent all Filipino young girls who want to coach. It's just growing up, there wasn't anyone like me in this space. The only other Filipino I know of is a male head coach, Chris Chang, who's been on the international stage with Team Canada. But aside from him, I don't know anyone else. And so for me, I'm just like grateful for the opportunity to use a platform that I have. And I'm not entirely sure if I answered the whole question.
You did.
Yeah. Oh, this part, because I know that we did discuss this at one point. In terms of my sexuality and being within the coaching space, dealing with the prep school athletes that I deal with, I was a head coach last year, and I was a den parent as well at a program. And for me, I don't necessarily present as obviously queer, but I was very open in a discussion with the owners of the program. And for me, in my mind, I wanted to make sure that coaching my female athletes, they knew nothing about that. Because at the same time, it's hard when you're living with your athletes, being their parent as well as their coach. And I remember distinctly that there was a relationship like that went viral when I was their age out in Hamilton. And so I think what a lot of people don't realize is some people are hesitant to hire women because they think that they'll get involved with the guys on the team. But not everyone understands that there could be that man who gets involved with a boy on the team, or there could be that girl that gets involved with a head coach who's a woman on the team as well. So that's where all the stereotypes need to be broken down, and realize that, like Natasha said, people are people, personalities are personalities. Gender is just a construct. And so we're born with different parts, but in terms of mentality, who's to say that who's to say that an individual who goes into a coaching space won't be in any kind of relationship with this younger athlete or with this adult athlete? And I think that's something that people need to be very mindful of. And I think that adds to that ceiling that we're all trying to break through in a male-dominated space.
Christine, can you talk a little bit about leadership? We see a lot of different diversity and inclusion activities taking place right now in sports. Can you talk a little bit about some of your work with executives and leaderships to educate them and to also get them in a space where they are including some of these policies and initiatives within their own sports business?
Yeah, I can say that currently the trend is more so around folks asking, how do we get more diverse people in our committees? Because if we be very honest about the landscape of sports in Canada, is that it still looks very, and folks I think often find that to be even very hard to name. And so a lot of times it's just me having conversations on the side with folks, with leaders, and saying like, hey, here's some things to think about as a person, like individually, because a lot of this work starts from within. It starts from reflecting on our own experiences, reflecting on sort of what are the voices that we're growing up with and representation that we have around us. And so it requires almost that little bit of coaching with leaders at first, and then for them to make an informed decision around, okay, so either they're starting a D&I sort of diversity and inclusion committee, or that they already have one, but again, looking more for folks who can share more diverse experiences and stories. And from there, a lot of times it's then me sort of consulting or coaching them through that process and saying, you can't expect specifically racialized folks to be sharing their stories just so that you can fill this out in a report. And that these stories exist everywhere, and it exists every day. And so it's naming those things for folks to say, oh, right, okay, so I'm actually learning, and that they need to be, and I prompt them to learn outside of the sports realm and look within, because sports institutions operate very much like any other institution. And I'd even say there are articles out there now more so around how white supremacy actually weaponizes the sport institution to uphold whiteness. And that's, I'm sure that may make a lot of folks uncomfortable even in naming that. I highly recommend folks to Google it. There's plenty of more voices coming out and talking about that and how that manifests. But that, in working with leaders, it's all about naming those things. And I also, too, experience quite a bit of harm in that process and having to hold that space for people. So it does take a lot of work right now working with leaders, and it requires them to have an invested interest. And most people have I'd say all of them have great intentions in moving things forward. They want to grow their programs and their sports, but they just don't quite have the language or the tools. So it's kickstarting that off for them individually, and then also in thinking about as a leader, and then as a leader of a sport organization, and perhaps as a sport too, depending on the type of sport. So, you know, it's very different looking at basketball versus I don't know, water polo, right? And then also team sports versus individual sports, and all of those different dynamics all come out differently. And then there's sports that also are dominated by women. So thinking about synchronized swimming and skating, ice skating. And those folks are thinking about how do we bring more men into, or boys into the sport. And so it's opening that up, that dialogue, and then making the connections, because a lot of times gender kind of lives here, and gender diversity lives here, and then also sort of racial diversity lives here. And you know, introducing the concept of intersectionality is, I'd say, 90% of my time right now, and coaching leaders through understanding what that actually looks like, because many of us live at the intersections of so many different identities, and the harms are always simultaneous when it happens. So. And then, yes, for sure, around policy, folks are looking at changing those pieces as well. Like I said, there's a lot of focus on safe sport right now, more so on sexual harassment. And I've been trying to have some more conversation with folks just to expand the notion of that, to also add in gender diversity, to also add in the aspects of race or any other types of identities that may come into play. So it is a great moment in time, I'd say, but an unfortunate way to arrive here, of course. But that there is a lot of uptake, I'd say. As you said, there's a lot of activities right now. And it's a great opportunity for folks to really be thinking about how they want to commit to this work, because a lot of people are waiting for accountability. And folks don't actually know that is a process to be happening first before they can even move forward, to look at what harms have already been done. So that's mostly the conversation. Yeah, I've had to really push forward in terms of advocacy, even thinking about what does non-binary inclusion look like in sports. And I personally often joke that we just have to kind of smash the institution and recreate a new one. But that's not the case, or that's not possible. So how do we work together with folks who are experts of different experiences and identities, and really pull that together?
We have a few more minutes before we get into the Q&A. So I'm going to ask all of you, how are you using your own platforms to, you know, educate your sports communities on LGBTQ advocacy and inclusion? And so what are some of the conversations you're having with your communities? Aprille, do you want to go first?
Sure. I think for me, again, most of my work as of late has been dealing with anyone from high school and younger. And so, again, just mainly being someone who a lot of my peers can actually redirect youth towards, to talk about those kind of stresses, because at the same time too, I've realized that it never really starts off as an LGBTQ conversation. Mm-hmm. It always starts off as, I'm stressed. Coach, I'm stressed. I'm sad, I don't know what's going on with me, blah, blah, blah. And then picking at the why is where it usually comes up. And I realize that with the generation now of those high school athletes, they don't necessarily understand what it is that they want to do. So without even, I think as coaches and as adults, setting an example for them, it's really teaching them to learn about who they are first before they can even think about what they want to do in the future. I find that, you know, as a society, we've been so eager to, or pushy to tell kids, like, you have to pick a career, you have to go to university, you have to go to college. But then mentally, they never think about like, what are we going through, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think, especially Christine, like in your space, to think that there is someone like you that's a pro in that space was not something that you learn in university anyways, right? So just encouraging things like that. And I think moving forward, that's what I'll continue to do, is just be an ear for someone or a young individual who is looking to get into sports, and how we can battle through that self-identity discovery discussion.
Natasha?
I'm gonna piggyback off what Aprille said, actually. You kind of hit the nail on the head for me. I think for me, recognizing why certain athletes or females, or even, you know, younger athletes, recognizing why they gravitate towards me, you know, like my little fan base that I have of females. And I think it, now being a little bit more open and wanting to support and be there and thinking about the cause, understanding or questioning why it is that they gravitate towards me, and being that ear to listen. And Aprille's right, a lot of the time it starts off with, you know, I'm stressed, or this is what's going on, or I'm depressed. And then the more you are there to listen and to hear and to offer, you know, a safe space for them to open up, then you kind of get to the root of why it is. And a lot of the time it comes full circle, and I'm like, there it is. So that's why that person is, you know, liking all my posts and sending messages, and so separating, I guess, the fan base, and picking and choosing who it is that I devote my time to, and my personal experiences to, and being there for them. I never had that. And for a long while, I was very unaware that I could be that for anybody. So it is rewarding, but it is very rewarding to know that you're able to help with, you know, a kid that's coming up in the environment you came up in, or a teenager, or a young woman that is in a gym and is feeling a certain way, and you know, sharing just your experiences sometimes helps. I think as well, using social media there's a lot circulating on social media, and not all of it is true, not all of it is real, but using that platform to even just repost, which is something that I never used to do, because I didn't want to get into things, I didn't want to start things. I internalize a lot, and I overthink a lot. So for me, just hitting the repost and sending something on my page out to, you know, my followers, and letting them know, like, this is my view on this stuff, reading the comments, and knowing that it's helped people, just to see that, you know, I stand by them. I might not necessarily relate, but I can advocate for them, stand by them, or maybe know someone that's going through something like that. And not being so scared or timid or shy or worried about too much of what certain followers will feel if I post this. You know, just being that voice has been huge for me in the past little while.
And Christine, I'll ask you as well. I know we're kind of getting tight to the time of our Q&A, so maybe just really quickly, how are you using your platform?
I share a lot on my platform. I use Facebook and in my networks too, and connections to reshare, as folks have already mentioned. And I also use that to round up resources for myself to continue to learn, because I too also come into practicing allyship as somebody who isn't Black, or who isn't mostly disabled. I definitely have some invisible sort of disabilities, you know, with concussions, with different experiences and whatnot. So definitely resharing, learning, and modeling that learning, modeling the accountability pieces online and publicly. I use social media a lot, LinkedIn. I think that's also where you picked up on the quote. And I try to make that as accessible for folks as well, so that I can practice what I'm preaching to folks at large. So,
well, thank you guys for sharing, you know, your experiences, your journey, and your truths. This is a great conversation. For those of you who want to continue following our guests, Aprille Deus, I know you're on Instagram. Is it Coach Aprille Deus?
Yeah.
And Natasha, you're also on Instagram. I believe it's Natasha Spence, or The Nightmare.
I believe it's Natasha Nightmare Spence.
Natasha Nightmare Spence. And
Yeah.
Christine, you noted you're on Facebook. So, you know, continue to tune in on these channels, on these social media profiles to find out what next our guests are doing. So I'll throw it back to Vanessa from the Canadian Women in Sport, and she's going to help us moderate this Q&A.
Thanks, Ainka. So we have a handful of really great questions. I will start with one that I believe is for Aprille. So this is from an anonymous attendee, and it says, as a female coach to a men's team, have you experienced backlash from your players? And if so, how did you deal with it?
I've been lucky where I just kind of walk into space and I just am who I am. And I think when a woman does walk into a space who actually gives you feedback, there is something to be said about that kind of energy. I find that women who actually don't really know what they're talking about to an athlete will just ramble on. And so for me, I've only ever had one instance where a player just kind of gave me attitude, but I think it's because he was heated in the moment. So my suggestion more so dealing with being a woman in a male space is observing is a really good trait that I have. It's a really good skill to have. And then knowing how to communicate what you want to communicate. Like, is it the right time? Is this necessary? Is it something that he's constantly picked on about? Maybe pulling him aside to talk. So it's just, again, I don't think there's necessarily a right way to approach the situation. But when you have backlash from males, just understand that there's always this like stereotype of women don't necessarily know what they're talking about in a male space. So going into it and really backing it up with confidence is how I've dealt with any relative situation.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing. So another question that we have here, and I'll pose this to anybody who's interested in answering or addressing it, is when you have a white male staff or higher up seeming to resist necessary changes to make sure female or LGBTQI2S+ athletes feel served equally or with equity, what strategies do you use to help them hear your side of the story and recognize the importance of the barriers these individuals face to make the brave choice to show up?
Christine, do you want to take that?
Let me see here. Sorry, I'm reading through all the questions of the Q&A right now.
Yeah, so it's in the Q&A, and it is I think it's the third question that came in at 12:45. So there's a lot to it, but how I interpreted it is when you're, addressing issues with your superior who hold, a higher, social, a little social capital or privilege, and they're experiencing some resistance. How do you get your message across?
Yeah, so it would definitely take more than 2 minutes to answer that question. But I think you're essentially organizing within that organization. It's finding out somebody else who's on sort of a higher management level, who may be able to listen to you, to essentially find an ally is what I'm saying, in that higher level management. And for that person to slowly, or perhaps to just share with the person who's in leadership, to talk about those issues. And if they're continuing to be resistant, then looking into your policies, looking into the vision and mission of the sport organization, because a lot of times I think most organizations have some sense of inclusion embedded into it. And so that's where you can use that policy and use the folks around you and also above you who are listening, to hold people accountable in the organization. That said, of course, it's going to take a lot of work. This is advocacy work and may very much be self-advocacy work. And so I always prompt folks to really think about what is necessary for you to feel supported in doing that work as well, because it is very tiring, and it becomes a second job, essentially, when you're doing that type of work in an organization, when there is already resistance. If you do have some leverage or some pull, inviting guest speakers, I'd say the most effective way is getting somebody external from the organization to come in and say things that you may not necessarily be able to say, because those things may put you at risk of your job security, and also of your own safety as well. So finding people who are doing the work that I do. There are plenty of others who do this work. Even if they don't know about sports, they'll be able to work with you, and for you to also take up some of that, build some capacity for yourself to be able to do this work further. So that's what I would recommend in terms of doing that. Of course, picking the right person to practice allyship also helps. I'm very strategic in who I pick and bring along with me. So if it's a topic about race, I always bring somebody who I trust who is white or light-skinned to be able to step into that space and say things that I may not be heard in the right way. And also for them to practice and model allyship for other people to learn from as well. So those are some key tips that you can hopefully walk away with to figure out your next steps.
Awesome. Thanks so much for sharing that. Definitely tons of tips in there, but still a really challenging question to try and tackle in such a short period of time. So thank you, Christine. Natasha, this one was either came in before or around the time that you started speaking about your platform and being a role model in the space. And an attendee is just wondering, how do you manage that pressure of occupying the space of being a role model?
It definitely has not been easy for me. Like I said, when I was speaking earlier, I internalize a lot and I overthink a lot. And there are times where I literally will lay awake at night and not sleep at all for the whole night because I think back to, well, should I have said this or should I have done this? Or when I reposted this, should I have done this? And I think just pretty recently, actually, just accepting the fact that I'm only human and I'm doing my best and having good intentions and being genuine and true to you. I mean, that type of energy and giving that out, that's all you can do, and if you have no ill intentions and if you're just, a positive person and you just genuinely care about people, it does make it a lot easier. I think we can all do that. And even people that don't think that they necessarily have a platform, you might have a neighbor, you might have someone at work that you don't give them the time of day for whatever the reason, when if you just, take a step back and have a seat for 2 minutes, sometimes just listening and answering and sharing experiences can change people's lives. So removing myself from those situations and just trying to devote time, even if it's just 5 minutes, going through my DMs and choosing someone to reach out to. I had a message yesterday that I spent 2 minutes and literally at the end of it was like a million emojis and thank you so much for responding. And just the way that made me feel that they were actually that grateful that I just responded. It's not easy, but it's rewarding, and it's nice to know that you can be there for someone that you maybe didn't have when you were in that scenario.
That's amazing. That makes you, warms your heart, but definitely can't overlook all of the effort that goes into that. Christine, I think you would be able to answer this question. I am a queer BIPOC woman working in a sports organization that's recently asked me to help start a diversity and inclusion committee. I want to help be a part of it, but I also want to continue to feel safe at work. How do I create clear boundaries?
That's a good question.
Solid question. Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, self-advocacy work is super hard, and especially when you're put in a position that often feels very tokenizing. And that is a very common sort of position to be put in, unfortunately. So I'm glad that you're thinking about the types of boundaries you need to put in place to feel safer. Again, finding somebody who you trust to do it with you is the first thing that came to mind in the sense of like, anytime that, and you can create sort of a relationship with that person and saying, here are the things that I trust you, reasons why I trust you, and having that dialogue about how that person can better show up for you in moments can really help you be able to go further. So this is sort of the co-facilitation model that I use with the team that I work with, to essentially help draw those boundaries and enforce those boundaries, both explicitly and implicitly. So if anybody were to say, oh, hey, you're this race, can you speak on this? Which is very tokenizing. Your pal can then very much say, you know what, that doesn't sound like a great question. Can you reframe it? Or what are you actually asking for when you're asking this person to answer this question? So thinking about instances that you can anticipate come up, or questions, and then have this person understand what that experience is like, and then for them to step up, can help you enforce those boundaries in ways that you don't have to necessarily share those boundaries with everybody. And hopefully that will help you feel a little bit safer at work, because you've got a trusted pal or two to step up for you. So hopefully that helps.
Awesome, thank you. Did Natasha or Aprille, you want to add anything about boundaries and how you approach these conversations?
I'm going to definitely agree with Christine, and I'm just reflecting on different scenarios I've been in, and that has always been my approach. Is you find that person that kind of is on the same level, or is very open or understanding or genuine or compassionate, and when you have that person, having conversations with them beforehand and almost almost teaching them and letting them know how you feel before you're in that scenario, so that they can step up and be like, hey, because a lot of the time when you're dealing with people that are either ignorant or have certain biases, they see you as the problem, and it's sad and unfortunate because you are not the problem, and actually they are. But when you can remove yourself from that situation and let someone else step in and advocate for you, a lot of the time it not only puts them in the place, but sometimes it opens their eyes. So when the problem in their eyes is removed and someone else is interjecting, a lot of the times it's like, oh, wow, maybe I am the problem. And they, whether they actually, do a full turn and take back what it is that they've said, or whether they just, close their mouth and move on, it's easier to have someone else sometimes, not necessarily easier, it's sometimes a better approach to have someone else as opposed to, you being the one to approach it. So
yeah, I like that. And
yeah,
I think
thank you.
to piggyback off the two is the minority is the majority, like all the time. And people don't realize that because they think that the person in power, like everyone else in the executive, has the same idea. But I think going into conversations with the right mindset, like if you're scared, you're not having that conversation. Don't even do it. You have to be very logical. You have to do your homework. So like if you come prepared with a deck or something to talk about why this is a good idea, why it's not a good idea, will only show like, okay, at least if I don't accept it, like she actually tried or they actually tried. And just having that open conversation and knowing that, like, there's a term in marketing, like the ask. It's like, you just actually have to have the conversation or else you'll never know, because then who knows if Christine went to the president and she got shot down, Natasha went, she got shot down, and then Ainka went and got shot down, and then I went, and I'm like, okay, there is something to this. Then at least you have 3 other people around you who can actually help in that situation that you're looking to get an answer for.
Awesome, thank you so much. I think that's a wrap for the Q&A. There is one more question. It's a little bit too broad, just about what can staff and volunteers do at the PSO level. So provincial sport organizations, to be more inclusive. I think a lot of the responses that we just had speak to that, and particularly in allyship, and allyship being a recurring answer about boundaries and how to address issues and this and that. And I would take this opportunity to speak to anybody who's attending right now who is white and isn't in that position, to say, maybe take a moment and reflect on your own behaviors and the space that you hold, and see why people aren't reaching out to you to assist with their advocacy. So if there's anything that you need to do to clean up house before you can enter this space. Just a big thank you to everybody who participated today. Ainka for hosting, She's for Sport, Sport Canada. This was, really valuable experience. I'm seeing a lot of activity in our chat and on Facebook. So thank you so much for advancing this conversation and with the support of profiling these key voices and leaders in sport. Merci à She's for Sport et à Sport Canada d'avoir fait progresser cette conversation et de dresser le profil des participants, principales voix et leaders du sport aujourd'hui.